Hi, folks. Back here. I think this is the 9th episode so far of the podcast. Of the Platform Thinking podcast. Been talking to a lot of interesting people, trying to get some ideas about what people should think about when designing platforms, thinking about platforms. Today, I'm really excited to have Barry with me. Barry's been talking about some really interesting ideas in architecture. Generally have the sensation that this platform conversation is kind of like the revenge of the architect's moment. So I'm really excited to kind of talk to Barry about his ideas about that. Do you want to introduce yourself to everybody, Barry?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Barry O'Reilly. I'm based in Stockholm, in Sweden. I'm currently in Oslo, in Norway. I'm an architect. I've been an architect for a very long time, a software architect. And I've been a chief architect at Microsoft. I've been a global lead for architecture community at Microsoft. I've spent a lot of time, a lot of the last 10 years, really focusing on how do we educate, train, teach, and make architects out of senior developers. I'm also finishing off a Ph.D. So that work led me to asking an awful lot of awkward questions to which there were no answers, so I had to go looking for them. And I'm currently finishing a PhD in complexity science and software design. So eventually these kind of questions, hard questions around architecture, lead you to the complexity sciences, and that's where you end up kind of naturally.
Yeah. I feel like we've been traveling parallel paths a little bit. I did a lot of work with some large companies training architects specifically around kind of complexity theory, kind of ways of designing, thinking about like moving away from like kind of approval based architecture, like rubber stamping, town planner type style, to like what is design, what is architecture from a designerly perspective, how do you create kind of evolving, moving, becoming things as opposed to static defended things, I guess.
I've had a very similar journey to that. I think I've been very lucky in the kind of work, and and I always, when I'm teaching architects, I always say that we don't really get to choose who we are, who we become as architects. You're formed by the company, by the economy that you're in, by the projects that you get a chance to work in. Yeah. And I was lucky enough to be pushed into enterprise architecture while still having a very heavy technical focus. So I had both of these things at once, and I was then able to question the idea that no, you leave all this technical stuff behind and you just draw lines and boxes. So I think, well, no, that's not going to work for me, and it generally doesn't work in projects. And in delivering architecture, and that led to me having a kind of contrarian view to the enterprise architects that I was surrounded by, very much, where they would say, no, we just do business, and I would say, controversially, you don't do any business. You talk about it, and you're not doing any technology either. And people are starting to ask questions about where all the money's going. And that's played itself out over the last 10 years. And I think now that the kind of thing I used to say, I had enterprise architects in London practically throwing chairs at a conference back in I think the kind of things that used to be controversial are now accepted. It's accepted that enterprise architecture ran out of road. It didn't have an ambition. It didn't have a vision of the future, and it lost touch with technology. It's still there very much. And there still are some things that need to be solved that even my approach doesn't solve on a managerial level within IT departments. But it's died off a little bit, and so it's easier for me to speak these days. And so, funny saying that, just this morning, I have a session I do called the Philosophy of Architecture, where I say that, look, you shouldn't be reading technical books anymore. Once you get to a certain level, you need to dig deeper, and that deeper is philosophical texts and ideas. And I've delivered that session many times for architects, and they buy it. They've been around long enough to understand what's happening. I did it this morning for the first time at a developer conference, and I was very nervous about that because it's very far away from what they do. But it went over really, really well.
Cool.
So I use the Matrix movie to softly introduce some topics and in a way that's familiar. So that worked quite well.
Cool. Yeah, I have this like sarcastic version of enterprise architecture where I say in most organizations, enterprise architecture is an extension of procurement. It's like what you can and can't buy with no other advice. It's like you can use these tools, you can't use those tools. And then you have this weird thing where you got like solutions architects are like designing these point-based solutions based on what they're allowed to buy from procurement, right? But like, leaves this weird hole, I think, that is what we're trying to deal with right now with platforms, right? Like there's this weird hole where there's been this lack of attempt to create like significant cross-cutting systems that support multiple teams, multiple product organizational components. And so you get just like this, I would say this like not great version of complexity, which is kind of scattered, unintentional, complexity by omission style, as opposed to any attempt to kind of, wrangle with or use usefully the value that complexity can bring to certain parts of the organization. So like, just so before we get started, like how would you kind of like define a platform from your perspective as an architect? What kind of conversations are you having around platforms these days?
The complicated answer, which we would have to spend several minutes digging into, is that a platform is a provider of residue, where the developers don't have the time or inclination to provide it themselves. That's a very short, succinct definition, but you have to define residue for that to make sense.
Yep.
But and that's really what it is. It provides things to different, possibly disparate points of the enterprise that they can use in a way that's easy, safe, accessible, and solid. In order to speed things up. That's been my classical understanding of platform, and that's not from any study of platform engineering. That's from an instinctive base that from doing this for 20 years. Because I think a lot of what's called platform engineering today are things that a lot of us were doing 20 years ago. We didn't call it that. We just had to survive. And it was like, this is, if we don't get a grip on this, then there's going to be problems. And the platform kind of came to be over time.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah. So why don't we start with this term residual? I think I have a rough grasp on it, but let's the audience in on the secret a little bit. What do we mean by residual? We're kind of pointing at that.
Yeah. So the ideas that I've come up with. So I spent a long time. Well, I'll go right back to the start. In 2014, I went over to head office in Seattle, and we were just rolling out this thing called Azure, and Azure is a platform, mother of all platforms, I would say. And they said to me, "Look, what we need you to do is teach architects. We need you to create architects. We need you to make lots of them because there's a huge shortage." And the move to cloud had really exacerbated the gap that was there for enterprise architects, because they really started to suffer because the technology that they'd left behind, that started to hurt. And I took a step back and said, well, what do you want me to teach them? And they said, well, just teach them to do whatever it is you do. And that caused me to freak out a little bit, because I had to go back to my hotel room. I said, what do I do? And after a couple of days of thinking about it and being honest about it, I had to say, I don't know what I do. I turn up in a room, I say things, and people are happy. That's what happens. I have nothing beyond that. And it's very reminiscent, if you've read, and I'm sure you have read, The Reflective Practitioner. And that's what had happened to me, and what's happened to all of us. And it leaves you in a position where you can't really explain how you know what you know. You say, I know this is right, but I have no idea why. And so I started digging into that. I said, well, how do I know? What is my process? What is it that I do? And one of the things that was kind of constant in my career was that people would be very pleased with what I delivered, but they'd also say, you're very negative. You're always, you're so pessimistic. It doesn't matter how good something is, you're like, it's going to break.
Yeah.
And what I realized that I was doing is that I would take a very simple architecture. I wouldn't put any effort into it, just sketch it on a board and say, well, here it is, it's 2 components. And rather than gathering requirements, rather than talking about risk, rather than having workshops, I would just start messing with it. I would break it. And when it broke, I would put it back together. And then I would break it again and break it again. And that was roughly what I was doing. And then I read the work, Taleb's work with and started to realize he said something really, really interesting in the book Anti-Fragile. Not the concept of anti-fragility itself, but the key point was that there are some systems out there that survive things that they had no idea existed. They weren't designed to survive the thing; they just do.
Yeah.
And that started me thinking, this is kind of along the same lines, and I started digging into the complexity sciences and looking for an explanation around what is it that why does this work? Why does it work to be incredibly negative all the time, which is how I was describing what I was doing by stressing a system. And what I realized then, as I dug deeper into complexity, I realized that there aren't even any answers in complexity for me. So I had to go a level deeper then into philosophy. And I realized that I had this view of the world, which is very philosophical, and that is that the world isn't made up of things or objects or stuff that we interact with. The world is, it's a processual idea. So the world is made up of a bunch of processes interacting, and everything is becoming. But we still do. There still is stuff in front of us. There's stuff we work with, and as architects, we have to represent. So we have to draw. So we have to show something, and those representations and the stuff that's actually there, those are just leftovers because they're just the results of churn of processes we don't understand or see. And that's what a residue is. And so what I say is a complex system is just a series of residues, stuff that's left over as the thing keeps breaking or changing. And so a residue is just whatever's left over when a system gets stressed. So in a very abstract way, then, instead of describing my software systems then as components or thinking of them as components and processes that execute, that's just one specific way to look at a system. I look at a system as a stack of residues, and those residues are obviously have a lot of overlap, and they're very interconnected, and they form very strange shapes if you try to draw them. That's a completely different way of thinking about what do I have in front of me. And if you're, if I don't know if your listeners know their philosophy, but it's very close to Bergson and Deleuze, their ideas around multiplicities and the virtual and that kind of thing. And so a residue, in effect, is just whatever's left over. So if you have a house and I burn it down, your residue is ashes. But if you have a house and you put a safe in it that's fireproof and I burn it down, your residue is ashes plus whatever's in the safe. And that's the way I started to think about, this is how we describe architecture, this is how we work with it. And the discovery then was that as you do this, as you move through an architecture and build this stack of residues, the system starts to, on its own, survive things that you hadn't prepared it for, which is exactly the problem that I think most architects and most platforms have to be able to solve. And that's the interesting thing. And so what my research is focused on at the minute is showing that this happens in a statistically significant way. And it happens every time we do this. So I'm trying to break my own trying to stress the ideas, because it just seems to happen very, very naturally. It's a very good way to teach architects to be independent in their work. So they're not running around saying, and one of the things that frustrates me with junior architects is they'll say, what's the best practice here? So there is no best practice. You have to figure this out. And this gives them a set of tools that helps them push their way forward, as well as teaching them that there are no right answers here. You can push it forward, but you can never really be right.
Cool. It makes me think of a bunch of different things. But let's start with. I feel like to me that partly what you're describing is kind of like an invert of what I've heard other people talk about with architecture. So like Grady Booch, right? Grady's kind of like his famous, or I think his apocryphal or famous statement about architecture. Architecture is about the decisions that are hard to undo, right? Like he's almost talking about this way in which when you make decisions, they lock into the system, they become hard to take apart again, they change the optionality and things like this. Whereas you're saying, like, to some extent, architecture is about decisions about what survives and what to do about what survives, which I think is interesting. And I guess that, you know, the thing that I kind of wanted to poke at a little bit in a related way is, I don't know if have you ever read any of like Chris Matt's stuff? He's more on the business analyst side, but he likes to talk about black shoals and optionality and commitment and things like this. And so there's this like weird thing, I think, where you could almost argue that that Booch's statement is about commitments, and your stuff is almost more about like optionality and creating option spaces, redefining or reopening option spaces and stuff like that. And the thing that I like, the language that I tend to use there is this idea of conditions consequences. Which is different than like the normal strategy. It's not about trying to project a state into the world. It's about saying, given the current state, what is the option space that is available from the current state? Do we want to modify or modulate the current state, the current interactions, the modularity, the granularity, in order to like achieve different option spaces? So I don't know. That's what it made me think of when you were talking. I don't know if you had any kind of.
Yeah, so I think that my work goes in the opposite direction to that in a sense, because one of the things, and I did a lot of work with an architect called Yuval Levy, if you've heard of him, and then he talks about this idea of volatility based decomposition, about being able to figure out what's volatile in my architecture and encapsulate that. And one of the things I realized was that if you work forward through complex systems, it never works because it's not possible. If the system's truly complex, you can't make a solid statement about what is volatile in this system. And it's the same with what Brady says. You can't tell what decisions are significant until after they become significant. And my thinking is that your architecture, regardless of what you think the requirements are, or what you think the volatilities are, or what you think the irreversible or reversible decisions are, the future is going to surprise you. It's going to throw things up, and it's going to hurt that system, and it's going to stress it. And so my belief is that there comes a point where a system has enough residues to be able to survive regardless of what gets thrown at it. And the goal of architecture then isn't to open up paths into the future or be specific about any of those things. It's about reaching this property of residuality. And so once a system is residual, then you can let it roll. And you can do that, and you can do that empirically. You can show that this system has a higher chance of surviving unknown sources of stress than a naive architecture. And once you've shown that, then that's all we can do as architects. If you then say, I would like this system to be able to do this in the event that the dollar drops against the euro, then you're putting your opinion into the system, and that's perfectly fine from a business perspective. If you have a gut feeling, if you want to make a bet, that's fine, and to put optionality in that way. But this is more of, how do I build a technical system that's going to survive in an environment that can't, in scientific terms, can't be described. And whereas a lot of those, like Yuval's idea about identifying volatility or identifying irreversible decisions, those are very much difficult things to do in a complex environment. You can't really say, and that's what I'm constantly trying to protect against, is making statements about a future that are just my opinion or a bias. Because our opinions and our biases tend to focus in on what we think is probable, and that becomes difficult in social groups, and then you end up with these very limited systems, and we call it technical debt. It's whenever one person complains about everyone else's projected bias into the future. And that leads to And that leads just back down the garden path to the same kind of forward projection that we've been trying to do for 2-3 generations of software architect now, and it's all very Newtonian. It's all very we will be able to predict what's going to happen in the future.
Totally. Yeah.
It generally comes back to that, whereas this is much more, and this is difficult for architects to grasp. It's like, we're going to give up all of this projection and prediction of the future and ability to say what's going to happen. And what my work then becomes, if you follow the ideas, it becomes very much about defining boundaries in your software and having a good, solid reason for defining those boundaries and saying these boundaries will take us to the next step. It won't be some magical system that survives everything, but it will be empirically survive things that it hasn't been built to survive, which is what we're asked to do as architects. When we boil down our job, they're saying build something, we don't know what's going to happen in the future, but we're going to say it has bad quality if it doesn't survive in this unknown future. And that's the issue that all of us have to face as architects.
Yeah. And I like that, like, the answer isn't to try to reduce the future states, right? The answer isn't to like make the future more predictable somehow, because that's actually literally just is incoherent nonsense in my mind.
Yes, it is. And you'll get very far actually if you're an architect, and this is something that I teach my students, because this is a trap that they can fall into, is that once you get good at this, building these residual architectures, people notice. And they notice that, hey, this wasn't in the requirements spec, but it's still running even though this thing happened or this change happened. And then they'll come to you and they'll say, how did you do this? And, explaining residuality is not something you do to managers generally. And so the temptation is to say, you know what, I'm kind of magic. I knew this was going to happen. And then you fall back into that trap of saying that I predicted it, which is never true. Very, very, very rarely true. And I can't remember what the question was now. I went off on one there.
Look, I think I was making a comment about, like, the futures that can't be possibly reduced.
Yeah. So there's a tendency to pretend that we can predict those future states or that we can reduce them. And there's an idea these days that we can constrain the future by making decisions, which is, sometimes that will play out, but generally there's no scientific reason to believe that we can do that. And when we do it, there tends to be a lot of hindsight bias to say, well, I did that because I knew this was going to happen. There's too many variables generally to capture these things. And so it is a very negative way of thinking about things. It's like, we're going to prepare and we're going to show that preparation holds up against things that we don't know, but we're not making any guarantees about what we can survive. And so the ideas are based on Kaufman's idea of attractors, so to generate your residues for your architecture, we use random simulation. So you're not even using things that you think are going to happen. It's stupid stuff. You can use anything, because once we get our design, we throw away all the stressors. We're not actually specifically building to survive a particular set of conditions. We're just looking for boundaries that hold up in different attractors, and it's basically an attractor search is what we're doing through random simulation. And then we use Kaufman's NK model to pull the component structures out of the residues.
Tell me a little bit more about, like, so if I understand it correctly, part of this activity that you're talking about right now has to do with stressors and kind of applying stressors to, like, is it completely random stressor? Like, what is a stressor, and then how do people find them, I guess is my question.
Yeah. So a stressor is anything that you currently don't know about. So if you have a design in front of you and you haven't thought about what happens when a competitor drops their price, then when a competitor drops their price, your system will become stressed. So a stressor is anything outside of what you currently understand. And what will happen is, when a stressor acts on the system, if it affects the system, in a particular way, it will push the system to another attractor. It'll be in a different part of the phase space. Different things will happen. And at that point, you will ask, does my software architecture, which is the thing I can control, does my software architecture hold up in this attractor? Does it still exist there? Does it still work, or do I have to change this residue? So go in and put this. Do I have to have a safe in this house so that there's something left so that we can take the next step? And we do that repeatedly. And it turns out then that whenever you have it, you come up with a stressor. And the example I always use, because it's ridiculous, is this idea of fire-breathing lizards that destroy a city.
Yeah.
And I use that to teach students that, look, probability has nothing to do with this. We don't care about what's actually going to happen. So there's these fire-breathing lizards, which we're pretty sure don't exist. But what happens if they hit our city? Do we still have an architecture? Does it still work? And the idea then, that's one stressor that pushes you into an attractor where the city's destroyed. And then I say, well, there are other stressors that can push you into that attractor. And it can be social unrest, or it can be electricity blackouts, or it can be invasion or war or a pandemic where the city isn't destroyed, but no one can move. So it's like the city was destroyed. And all of those different stressors push you to that same attractor. And you only have to have one residue in that attractor to make it survive. And if it does, then you have a system that survives things that you haven't designed it for. And so there's a kind of mathematical leverage in what we do. So it looks like magic, but the mathematics is already there. But it only really works if the system is complex. It has to be a truly complex business system. For simpler systems, it's you'll find it very quickly very difficult to stress the system.
So I mean, I think that the thing that makes me think about right now, and you use the term technical debt too, and you have this other idea of hyperliminality, which I'd love to play with a little bit.
Yeah. So hyperliminality is, so if we think about different kinds of system, and so we can use Kinevin terminology, they complicated systems, which in I would describe in Kaufman terms, low N, low K. So a low number of nodes, a low number of connections, and they're predictable and they're controllable, and they're testable, and they'll have similar behavior over testing cycles. And we would call those ordered systems. And that is what software is. Software is an ordered system. It does what we tell it. It's highly constrained from it's electricity running through sand with constraints upon constraints upon constraints. And that exists when we build enterprise software anyway. It exists in an environment which is anything but ordered. It exists in this enterprise environment, which is a human environment, which has social structures, or structures is maybe the wrong word, social aspects and economic aspects and political aspects and markets and competitors and all this stuff moving around. It's a disordered system or a complex system. And when you put the ordered system inside a disordered system, then you're going to have a lot of pressures coming from as the disordered system moves through its phase states. It's going to push on that ordered system that you've built and break it. And so this is what a hyperliminal system that is then. It's an ordered system inside a disordered system, where we have the responsibility for the structure of that ordered system, but we don't have the science to describe the disordered system. That's what software architecture is. That's the challenge that we've taken on. That's why it's difficult. And so one of the challenges I think a lot of architects face, and the instinctive reaction of enterprise architecture, is to take their practices from the ordered system and just push those out into the disordered, and where they fall apart. And they keep falling apart. But for a generation or two generations, we keep pushing them back in because that's all we have. And so residuality is really an attempt to replace that rather painful process.
So I think the thing that it makes me think about a little bit, first of all, I love that you use Schoen's reflective practitioner. I don't know if you know, but Schoen published one of his first books with the Tavistock Institute, and the Tavistock Institute is the people who come up with socio-technical systems theory, right? And
Yeah.
I think like part of what you're describing, this is not the way other people in the DDD community necessarily use this term, but I use this term called socio-technical architecture, which I think is close to what you're pointing at. There's, on the technical aspect, there's kind of like hard truths at the bottom of it. Like light goes a certain amount of speed. CPUs can calculate a certain number of things per second. Networks have a certain amount of capacity. There's like some constraints on the system. It happens to be that most of those technical constraints radically under-constrain the phase space. Like you can do a lot of things with those constraints. Like they don't determine specific outcomes, right? Most of the time. Yeah, limits on the outcomes, what you could possibly do, calculations per minute, stuff like that. Whereas on the top, you get kind of the social architectural concerns, which are more about like, do I understand what the system's doing? Can I reason about what the system's doing in any way? Can I reason about what the system's doing in an unexpected context? And it's the kind of intersection between these two things that I think is interesting to me, because what I tend to see people interact with out there is either they go hard technical and they just want to do like, I need to know how many nines you want. I need to know blah, blah, blah. Or they go the opposite. I want to put a bunch of process in place. I want like emergence from the people. If we just let them do the right things, it'll all be good. Emergent architecture. And it's just like these two things get treated separately. And of course, to me, from a socio-technical systems theory, the goal is to create a jointly optimized system where both sides are being optimized in relationship to each other, which seems closer, I think, to what you're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah, and again, I'm pessimistic and negative about the whole thing, and say that in the social, what's called the social part of the socio-technical system, it can't be optimized according to me, because it's going to do what it does. It's going to, and we don't know, and we can't really control that. And so I think if you go down Emery's description of socio-technical systems, it's like if everyone gets to be free and happy, then the system will self-optimize, and that's I don't think that's true in all cases. Definitely people will be happier, but is the system optimized?
Yeah,
that's a different discussion. So I'm more about taking the technical and protecting it against the fact that anything can happen out there, and we're not entirely sure all the time. But it's very definitely the thing that's similar there is that my work will make you pay much closer attention to what's going on out there and what's going on across the boundary of these two things. So I guess optimization might be a more positive way of describing the same work.
Because it's like joint optimization, and I guess like Emery even gets eventually to the point where he doesn't like the term socio-technical. He just goes with open systems theory, right? Like eventually he just says, like, I want to get rid of a lot of those thoughts.
I've actually started to use the term socioeconomic just because it needs to be different than socio-technical, because it's taken on a lot of new meanings and a lot of new ideas out there. So I'm trying to kind of not bring any baggage into, because residuality is complicated enough without adding some more layers to it. But I think that hyperliminality is a very helpful concept. It was because, and it was, I was forced there by my PhD supervisor because I was being fluffy, and he was me, like chasing me around the room like a cat, trying to force me to stay still for 10 seconds and describe something. And hyperliminality was what helped me really say what it is that I'm trying to do. I was perhaps being a bit too delusive and fluffy in my description of things before that. So I love the term. It makes everything so much easier.
Yeah, I mean, so like in my work for my PhD, right? I also use a hyper term. It's a different hyper term than you do, but I start from a lot of the same kind of philosophical kind of points that you take. So like my stuff's about time and design, temporal design, emergent behaviors, systems, and things like that. So I also think process theory is more coherent to my mind than a lot of these other systems that people talk about. And the general way I usually describe it, similar to what you said, is like it's the interactions of processes that make it appear as if something is stable, right? So like things around us look like they're not moving, but if you look close enough, everything's like wiggling around. Nothing really sits still, that type of stuff. There's all sorts of really interesting questions about like, is it useful to think about a table as a bunch of atoms or not? But like, let's leave that to the side for 2 seconds. But I'm also a designer by thinking, by like, I'm doing design studies, so I'm doing philosophy of design, and so I have this natural instinct that I get jammed with, which is, I think that designers care about things that are material, that matter, that kind of like that you could touch and feel. In fact, they really care about the texture of wood and the feeling of leather. Like they have this really material interaction. And so I have this idea that I refer to as hypermateriality. And what it is I'm trying to get away from, which I don't think is far from where you are, but you can tell me. I'm trying to get away from this idea that was really popular for a while, which is everything that software engineers do is intangible. It's all in their heads. You can't touch it, so it's not real. And I want to point out, like, I think, you use the reference to technical debt. I think technical debt is a perfect example of hypermateriality. It is when the system starts making decisions, pushing back against you, having a texture, having a feel. I mean, people even use the sensual terminology. It's got a smell to it. It becomes something that matters, right? So that what is material is not necessarily fixed, and it doesn't always stay the same in the system. In different contexts, different things materialize, because often what it is it's more about, can I get these interactions of processes to move at the speed that I need them to in order to react to some sort of change in the environment? If I can't, if they move slower than I need them to, that matters right now. That's a material problem, right? And so I think that, like, the difference there is trying to get people to realize that that's not, that materiality comes from the system in an environment being observed by an observer. It is not something you can predict. It's not something that like is a future state that you can try to understand. And I get really like picky about this, but like when people talk about trying to not create technical debt, I'm like, that's not a possibility. It's not possible you can't take on debt. You can refuse to pay your debt off, and that's probably not a great idea, but you create debt by creating things. That is debt making, right?
But by making choices, but you're excluding something. And often technical debt is only technical debt in the mind of the person observing the system who hasn't been able to do the thing that they want to do to prepare for the future that they see.
That's right.
And so technical debt is just a missing residue, or a whole stack of them. In my description of it, absolutely. So, do you familiar with the work of Karen Barad?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
I mean, again, there we're getting like more towards like a neo-animism or a vibrant matter theory, which I think is also really interesting. And like to me, certainly the vibrant matter theory feels close to what you're talking about as residuality. Is like, things are together for random reasons, not necessarily purposeful reasons, but they kind of reinforce each other and have agency that is beyond human agency and things like that, for sure.
So my wife is, and she's probably listening if she hasn't fallen asleep, and she's doing a PhD at the same time as me, in education. And before her influence, I was an innocent kind of computer scientist, mathematician, and I would talk about things. And so she's introduced me to Barad recently, but almost all of this is her fault, because I would just be sitting rambling and I was drawing these things called hyper networks and doing algebraic topology to try and explain residues, and she'd be like, no, you need Ceres, and you need Deleuze, and you need to read Foucault, and so a lot of that stuff comes from her. So just, as soon as I mentioned Barad there, I thought I'd better give her credit for that. Text me afterwards saying. got that from me again.
Yeah. I mean, I do like. I mean, I think that it's interesting. Like one of the ways that what it strikes me, from this in this conversation is like you're talking about what could potentially be described as like a radical decentering of human agency, or possibly even like a post-human architecture to some extent, where as you said, you're trying to defend the technical system from these like weird beings that make seemingly random decisions that may or may not affect anything. So yeah, I mean, like kind of like Barad, but also like Littorian theory and things like this seem to be stuff that ends up coming to play with trying to understand architecture from this perspective. Yeah.
Yeah. The way I'm describing it right now, I'm leaning very, very heavily on Deleuze's difference in repetition.
Yep.
And so in the talk I gave today, for example, I describe architecture as in the sense. So Deleuze says that there are no things, there are just differences. And the differences are made apparent by repetition, and some of them are ideal. And so when we contemplate things, we notice differences, and the repetition of that contemplation leads to understanding of what's there. And I show people that actually enterprise architecture, the old school way of doing architecture with requirements engineering and then risk and then the use of patterns and estimation and backlogs, all of these things are repetitions of the same question: what's going on here? And the differences that come up in those methods, that's where the architecture happens. And so the actual requirement specification or the risk register or your burn down or your estimates or your patterns, none of those things actually matter. It's the differences between those things that are producing your architecture. And residuality then is just radically pushing you to only think about difference, because every residue is a description of difference. And so it ends up being very, very Deleuzian.
Yeah.
And when reading difference in repetition, it's like, this is what I've been trying to say. But it's been very, very difficult to say. Obviously, very difficult for Deleuze to write as well, and even more difficult to interpret. But the ideas were already there in the 60s. But I mean, post-structuralism is a very long way from where we were as architects when we came up as programmers. I mean, that wasn't even on the agenda. It wasn't even a word we could spell.
Yeah.
So it's a big step away, but it's become easier to introduce the idea to architects and to developers over time, which I think is very, very encouraging.
Yeah. I mean, so like to me, I mean, there's two things that like I would tend to think about Deleuze. First, like, his concept of difference, right? Like he wrote this great book on Bergson, which you either read or you've read Bergson himself. But Bergson basically is saying the reason there is time is because things repeat, but they're never the same thing repeating. It's just a constant novelty, right? That's what temporality exists as. So I like the thing that I tend to take away from the Deleuze stuff. So like the residual stuff to me feels again like this materiality that I was pointing at. But one of the things I try to say to people is like, which you can tell me how far away I am from what you're thinking, but like what exists is what kind of is either produced or consistently reproduced. It's not something that's stable and does everything, because everything is a process. It must be reproduced. It can't simply exist. It can be produced once or reproduced multiple times, but it can't just simply exist without reproduction. And that to me is the part of the repetition aspect of what Deleuze ends up pointing at, is that since he's a process theorist, he's trying to understand how there is this kind of sense that there's material or static systems or something.
And I think if in that way of thinking, it's happening in two ways. So there are material things being produced, but there are also ideal things being produced. Every time you contemplate it, every time it changes, you contemplate it again. And even if it doesn't change, or that change isn't available to us through our sensibility, it changes as we contemplate it again. And so you've got those two processes moving, which I think is what he was getting at with transcendental empiricism. But I mean, I don't think anyone really understands all of these things. And possibly not even the man himself.
Yeah, we might need to take as much acid as he did in order to get there. Anyway,
yeah, and but I find that the ideas really chime with,
totally. Yeah.
and so I've been moving back and forth the last couple of months over Whitehead and Bergson and Deleuze. I keep coming back to Deleuze. It's a kind of as for me a rock star, and I find his other work fascinating as well, and he was so broad, and his work on Bergson and Nietzsche, and it's been it's a fantastic gateway into modern philosophy as well, I think.
Absolutely, yeah. My professor early in my PhD process, so this is my 10th year, so don't do what I've done, but anyway, told me just stay away from Deleuze for right now, because otherwise it's going to take you too long. And so I should have listened to him, because I spent a lot of time preparing to read Deleuze. And I love it. I think that like the other thing that we kind of get out of that eventually, like Deleuze's concept of flow and understanding flows of capital and territorialization and deterritorialization, all these things end up being, if we could introduce them appropriately, like super important ideas, I think, inside of the community. Like his ideas of flow, I think alone, in relationship to kind of like Fordism and post-Fordism, like could open up a lot of conversation about like how this idea of flow is working inside these organizations and things like that. Because in my mind, like one of the biggest problems we have in a lot of these organizations who want to talk about flow, around organizational design, around process theory and stuff like this, is very linear. It's like step one, step two, like flow is like down a step ladder or something like that. Whereas like I think he offers a really more insightful and interesting way of talking about kind of networks of flow and the way that kind of energies and intensities flow around. So I think that could be really interesting to play with too.
Yeah. I get asked the question a lot, and I've done some podcasts on it as well. So how does residuality play out when we apply it to organizational design and organizations? And that's where I can get a bit kind of cagey, and it's like, because one of the things that I've been trying to do, and one of the things that's been important to me, is I've been at times quite frustrated with the IT industry, because if someone decides I'm going to be an IT guru, all you need is some pretty slides and a bit of charisma, and there's no science behind it. You don't have to prove anything. And so they get up on stage and say, "This is what it is. Everything's made of alligators," and they build on that theory, and there's no proof. So one of the things I've been doing with residuality is saying, look, this has to be empirically shown to work. It has to be shown to work in a statistically significant way, because I want it to be scientific. And when it comes to organizational design, if you look at residuality and you look at what I say, you say, well, obviously this is going to work, because it just feels intuitively this is going to work. But I want to get away from intuition. I want to say, right, well, let's show that it works. Let's prove that it works. And so I'm kind of scared that someone is going to pick up these ideas and put some slides together and say, here's how you build a residual organization. But there'll be no scientific vetting of that idea. And whereas I will in a few months be able to say this works with software design. It'll be it's a whole other research project to say this works for the design of an organization. That's a much more involved research project than I want. I want to have a break.
Yes.
And it's not I mean software is my area of expertise. And software structures and architecture, and moving into organizational design, that needs to be a bigger project with more people in it. Have those areas of expertise. So it's not entirely proven, but it makes sense intuitively that an organization can be built to be residual as well. The problem is that in software, one of the things that makes residuality work is that most boundary decisions in software and configurations are cheap. The vast majority of them, and people get worried about residuality, say, this is going to cost too much money, but most boundary decisions are arbitrary. We're just making them less arbitrary. They don't cost anymore. Whereas human structures are not cheap, and moving them is not cheap, and having them be residual is not cheap. It's easy to spin up extra instances of things and have them behave in a slightly different way in a software system. It's not so easy to do that in human systems. So the cost might turn out to be a barrier to building residual systems. But I have had, a lot of interest from military people when I've published the papers on residuality, because obviously that's something that they're massively interested in. How do we keep shooting? kind of thing.
Yeah. So there's a couple other things that I was wondering about, like compare and contrast, or like things that feel similar to me, but I'm not sure. So like, is this stuff that you've thought about, or stuff that you think is significantly different than what you do? But like, so not even sure if this is intentional, but like we have like a resilient system concept, and we've got kind of a redundant system concepts, residual system now. But a lot of what you're describing feels like again a more post-human version of safety 2 theory, of resilience engineering theory. Whereas, like, the resilience engineering community would be very much talking about the social part of the system, so the very like human perceptions of the systems, and that resilience comes from the humans interacting with the system, not from the system itself. So I can immediately kind of grasp some differences, but at the same time, I feel like there's some, there's a lot of complexity theory that they're trying to deploy in resilience engineering communities, and there's a lot of concerns about like the way in which the disposition of the system opens up certain potentialities versus others, and that is a critical thing to pay attention to. Not the question of why did the human screw up, but why did the system allow the human to make a bad decision type questions, right? So so thoughts on that one?
So I've read the literature on resilience engineering, and I've never really connected with it. I think that they see the world a very different way than I do. I have written some things where I'm not so keen on the concept of resilience, because it doesn't mean anything anymore. And in my latest paper, I think I've been quite critical of the term resilience, because I'm saying that there is no identity, there's only difference, and resilience is a return to identity. I haven't been, and I've read some papers that have been quite critical of resilience engineering, and I've agreed with them. I can't find anything here. I can't find any substance. Yes, systems are complex. Yes, it's not always the human's fault when something happens. But safety is one of those things where I say, we can't close things down. We can't predict the future states of a system. We can't say what's volatile. We can't say what's safe and what's unsafe until after the fact.
Yep.
I've never really understood what it is that they're going to do, and that's been the difficulty for me with resilience engineering. But yes, and so I understand what they're saying, but a lot of what I've read feels like enterprise architecture. It's like a lot of, we want to solve this problem, but what is it? What are you going to do? Well, we have this method or this mapping or this tool, or we have things like STAMP. But it's not concrete enough. And so I actually make a reference to one paper. I can't remember which paper it is. It's a summary paper of the resilience movement, where they say that we don't have models, we don't have tools for these kind of things. And in my work, I'm saying, here's the gap. Here's where residuality comes in. And so residuality, I can in one train of thought, might be a replacement for the concept of resilience, which has become very, very weak over the years. So I haven't seen a great deal of solutions from them. Definitely haven't seen anything that can be applied to software engineering. It's still very linear. It's systems theoretic in most of its thinking. which is something I'm trying to move away from as well. So
yeah. I mean, I do think that a lot of the early literature feels a lot like that. I mean, like Decker, his drift into failure references, Foucault references a lot of the same kind of theory that I think the two of us enjoy. And I think there's arguments to be made that, while not in software architecture, they have done, safety 2 theory has done pretty interesting things in the airlines, making airline travel like the fastest, safest way to travel on the planet by applying kind of these ideas. Stop blaming the pilots for the planes crashing. That's not going to get us anywhere. We can't train them enough to predict the bad outcomes. We need to improve the systems to help them, things like that. But yeah, I do, I get the same thing sometimes from people when I talk to them about Ken Evan. They're like, this is really cool. This gives a lot of interesting ideas. What the fuck do I do with this now? Like, what am I supposed to do next?
Yeah. I could definitely see that as well. But I find it, I think there's still a lot of debate around what is this resilience engineering? What does it do? What does it mean?
Yep.
And there's nothing really that I could get my teeth into. And I read quite a considerable amount of material from some that Nancy Levison has written as well. There's some MIT Press stuff which is sort of freely available, which is really interesting stuff, but it's very, very mechanical. And their systems aren't hyperliminal in the same way that software is. I say that whenever you put an airplane up into the air, for example, the properties of aluminium aren't going to change because the customer base on the ground has a different idea about a thing. And so it's not hyperliminality in the same respect. That's where the difference is.
I like that. Again, it's a different different level of materiality, different level of what becomes important, and certainly the kind of social systems tend to have the ability to change what matters more quickly than aluminum does, for sure.
Yeah.
So what was it? I had I had a couple other questions. Here's one. In high school, my dad was a surgeon, and he was an orthopedist. So bone stuff, and I studied a lot about how bone structures work and stuff like that, and it makes me think. And actually, there's a great talk by Dr. Wood, which I can send you afterwards that you might.
Is it Richard Cook that does the talk?
Yeah, Dr. Cook.
Yeah.
Is it Cook or I think it's Wood, but anyway, it's one of the two of them. Anyway, point being, he talks about kind of bone density, and so to me, residuality. I immediately grasped kind of the osteoblast version, like the laying down of calcium to fortify bone under stress, right? And I think one of the interesting things that people don't normally think about, which I think is also interesting, is that I did marathons, and for the first part of your training, they basically say you have to run 17 miles. It does not matter how fast you run the 17 miles, really, for the first couple months, because the only thing you're doing is literally bashing your bones against concrete, because the stimulus is going to increase your bone density. It's going to make it so you don't, when I ask you to go fast, you don't get bone splints, right? Which I think is super interesting. So there is this kind of, again, this idea of there's certain types of systems that under stress kind of accrete these things that allow them to be more stable under certain forms of stress. But the thing that's also interesting, and that Cook tends to point out there, is this idea of osteoclast is there's a stripping of bone too, right? The system actually remains stable within the stressors. In other words, when the stressors are reduced, the bone density is simultaneously reduced, right? So the bone starts stripping itself down because it doesn't need that much weight or strength, or however you want to kind of think about it. And so I have this sense that one of the other things that we see in a lot of systems is like this lack of autophagy. There's this lack of like stripping away old dead material. And you pointed at this a little bit, like kind of propping up or like, keeping running these like faulty systems because we don't quite know how to replace them yet. I mean, what are your thoughts on like how to think about residuality and that kind of
thing? So those old systems would be residues. Those are leftovers. Those are things that are still there, and they, a residual system, just like a resilient system, I guess, is never optimal. There's always going to detritus lying around, stuff that's no good anymore until it's good. I think that's quite natural in most systems. We still have an appendix. We're not entirely sure why. That's a residue. Sure. In terms of software, then you tend to get a lot of older systems lying around, and it's difficult to see how they're useful. They are residues, but not every residue is good.
Yeah.
Sometimes stuff gets left lying around and it isn't particularly good.
Yeah. I mean, so is there like is there an active process for like harvesting dying parts of the system, or is the theory truly so influenced by kind of random stressors that it would be impossible to know what to harvest?
No, so I'm not sure what you mean by harvest, as in to get
I'm looking at that residue and I'm determining that one should be removed from the system because I think it's unhealthy for it to be in the system anymore. Like again, like an autophagic way. It's not even saying like all cells are bad. I don't want to kill all the cells. Just like that one is no longer functioning correctly. I need to kill that one to make space for new cells.
Yeah, and that's a business decision to take something away, I guess, and it's from a software perspective, if we look at the internal structure, we have some components lying around. We have some boundaries that are a hangover from an old system. I'm saying, should we take these away? Should we change these boundaries? And the way to get an answer to that is just to re-stress the system, to just throw stuff at it, that new stressors, and say, what happens? What are the other residues? What are the other directions? What are the other potentialities in this thing? And does this actually give us anything? And so on a very specific level, you'll find that I use these matrices to make component decisions by putting these stressors across things, and it's essentially an NKP analysis. It's a sort of Kaufman-based analysis of the system, and they'll tell you whether or not a component is actually useful. As part of a residue, does it actually contribute to anything? So one of the things that happens in these matrices is it allows architects to move between this concept of monolith and microservices and find the point where there is an actual criticality.
Right.
Do we need these pieces or not? But it's always very, very difficult to specifically point at something, say this is absolutely necessary, because it's the chorus of components and interactions that leads to criticality, and you're not sure what you're killing when you pull something away. So you can stress it. If you think that something isn't necessary, I guess you can stress the system with it and stress the system without it, and see which system actually performs better in the presence of unknown stress. And that will give you the answer to get rid of those things.
So I have two questions. I'm going to keep the second one in my head. I'm going to ask the first one, because you pointed at it a little bit. Like it's a granularity question to me. So I'm watching your Kaufman stuff, and I'm thinking some of the questions around granularity should go towards. I was thinking towards creating the right number of relationships. So like a small granular system has lots more potential relationships. It's got like a more finely grained API. it's not necessarily that API becomes more leaky or not, but in kind of your in your description of the Kauffman network, when we have a finer grain, more relationships, we like can potentially overstabilize the system, right? Like the system can become overly interdependent, become kind of stockish. Versus the opposite, we make things so big grained that there's very few relationships between the modules, and then maybe the system is not capable of creating, reproducing itself, stabilizing itself. But it also feels a little bit like N, right? Like N means like more smaller pieces versus less big pieces. So, you know, when people look at like the granularity of APIs, the granularity of services, you know, the granularity, the composability or decomposability of their services into platforms and things like that. Is that kind of like granular question one way of talking about or thinking through the right level of relationship and the way to stabilize the system?
Yeah, very, very much. Yeah. So what you'll find is that, or what I say in the talk when I talk about Kaufman, is that we're trying to find criticality, which is what an architecture should be seeking. And that's one of the kind of bylines for residuality, is criticality rather than correctness. And the problem is that it becomes very often a matter of opinion, just like technical debt. So what is the best solution here? Well, it should be loosely coupled. It should be microservices, or and there are disadvantages with that. As you break the services down, so your value for k, which is the number of links between the nodes, is going to explode. And which creates its own issues. And by running the stressors over these matrices, over these potential component things, you're actually asking different questions about what is K, what is N, what influence does this have on the system, and where should those boundaries be between these components. And that what that does is it's just difference in repetition again. It's forcing the architect to ask this question over and over and over again as they move through each stressor, through the matrix. It's forcing them to find coupling between things and realize that actually this is dangerous if I put these things in the same component, or sure, I can split this up into this many components, but it's not doing any good. It's not changing anything.
Yeah.
And you can compare and contrast different architectures. And what I'm trying to do with that matrix NKP analysis is to make explicit what's already happening in the heads of most architects, because all of this becomes just like Sean describes. Instinct, it's reflective. We know that this should be 3 components, and there should be 2 functions in this one, and 2 functions in this one, and 3 in this one. We know, but we can never tell anyone else why. And the matrices help us to tell ourselves this story so that we can better explain why.
Yeah.
Because what people are doing when you're looking at a component breakdown, you're stressing it. You're not saying this is a good component breakdown, because there's no difference between 2 component breakdowns in terms of function. You're stressing it, and the richness or your ability to simulate stress will determine whether or not the decision is grounded or not.
Yeah.
And that's what's happening.
Yeah.
When we do that.
So my other question is a little bit more about kind of like our futures conversations a little bit, and just so like again, so that I get the stressor idea in my head a little bit better. I suspect that you'll tell me I don't have it quite right, but so like one of the things that I don't like about futures is, from I think our mutual perspective, which is kind of like it's not just that the future, as in like the next 10 minutes, is unpredictable, although that is reasonably true. It's that 10 years is even more unpredictable. Like if we're based on kind of like the way components are interacting in your Kauffman network, time means more potential for changed relationships, introduction of new components, all sorts of things, so that it becomes literally just the phase space becomes, significantly, potentially infinitely larger as we move forward, right? Like just gets much bigger. So to me, like almost any sort of forecasting activity runs into a very quick wall. Like it just runs into a very quick probabilistic calculative wall where we can't reason about what the fuck the future is at that point anymore anyway. Like there's no way for us to reason because we have no idea what will be valid to reason about very quickly, right? And one of the ways I tend to point that out to people is I say, like, you all keep on telling me you want to change the world with your new dog food app. You should take yourself more seriously. If you change the world, you'll have to change your app because the context that you're operating in will be different, right?
Yeah.
Like, again, so the more successful you are in many of these activities of like creating stable, repetitive difference, the more likely it is that it's going to change other things. And therefore, like these things in theory never stabilize. They never come to be stable, right? So that's part of my objection to like at least forecasting futures, right? And then you get this other version, which is backcasting futures. Like I want to pick an ideal state to get to. I want to come back. I think that probably makes a little bit more sense in that it becomes a little bit more reasonable, as in like I can reason about it, but I don't necessarily think it actually causes us to make much better decisions. I think we get 2 steps down our causal chain that we've created backwards instead of forwards, and we find ourselves 2 steps from now, and the phase space has changed completely. We don't know what to do anymore. And then we get this kind of the other one, which I think might be still reasonably valid for the kind of social aspects that you've been pointing at, which is if I predict what I want the system to be in 1 or 2 steps, let's no further than that. Like I usually like to say, what are we doing next and what's the sequel, right?
Yeah.
Then the next question is like, if we had the next state, what's the other possible things that people might want to do with that thing? Because it often will literally pull us off course because there will be a new, even more desirable thing sideways from it, right?
Yeah.
So can we ration about that so that when we see that new attractor that we're predicting start to pull, we can do something about it or decide we're going to go there or whatever. Just a little bit of kind of flavoring of we don't have enough control, but we can sidecast a little bit. We can look at, given this state, what are adjacent likelinesses of this state? Not future likelinesses, but like things that are likely to be simultaneously true. And so this gets me into this like thing that I try to talk to people about sometimes, which is anticipatory awareness, or it's not situation planning, because I think that's a different thing. Although scenario planning and things like that would be an interesting thing for me to understand if that's anything to do with stressors or completely different than stressors. So that's one thing. But the anticipatory awareness stuff that I try to tell people is, listen, if you want to scan beyond, your next step or 2 steps, the phase space will get quite large. So the only thing you can do is you can say what might happen, but you can't plan for any of them to happen. What you can plan for is like, what kinds of things would we observe in the system just prior to the occurrence of these other things happening? Not causally, but dispositionally. Like if we see this, these are the set of kind of future stories that we might be paying attention to seeing in the future, in the near future, right? And so then I usually try to invert that a little bit, and I say like the kind of the phase space or the center that's defined by these futures that you think might happen, that predicts like a set of possibilities that you might want your architecture to move towards. Not one particular future, but like, oh, look, there's all these future potential stressors. The ones that you think are reasonably likely that you're paying attention to, you should start preparing your architecture to be capable of flowing into, as opposed to creating those potential future states. Is that anywhere close?
Yeah, there's a distinction between, so there's first the distinction between stressors and scenario analysis. So stressors are used to define the architectural structure. That's their job. They're a design tool, and then we throw them away. Yeah. And once we have our architecture, then we go back to as a business and say, this is what we're trying to do. What are the scenarios in the future that you think are going to happen? And that's when that's when your risk management and your due diligence are being done on a business level. And that's saying we have to prepare for futures that we believe might actually happen. And those are things that immediately become, they're no longer stressors. So if a business stakeholder says to me a competitor might drop their price, that's not a stressor. It's not going to be a surprise for anyone. We know that might be there. There is some understanding within that stakeholder group about what will be done if a competitor drops their price. What are the adjacencies? Is it a merger? Is it a retreat from the market? Is it a new offering? What do we do? And so that's a different thing than stressing the system. But if someone says that a future thing that might happen is that a competitor will drop their price, and that will cause some, there's a step beyond that or a step beyond that, then I immediately start stressing that concern. Well, what okay, a competitor might drop their price, but what if they raise their price? And what if they drop their price and we merge with them, but it turns out that that decision was actually disastrous and not sustainable for them, and start stressing the system by adding things on to those conversations. Well, what happens if there's things outside what we know, and building residue around that? And so the thing is that with residuality, what you're producing is a set of structured decisions about about software structure and architecture. It won't help you. It will help that architecture survive and change as things change, but it won't protect the business model. So I might take as a stressor that we do incredibly well in the market, and I might take as a stressor that there will appear 2 or 3 competitors in the market, but I'm not saying that that's actually going to happen. I'm just saying if that does happen, that pushes us to a particular attractor, and does the software structure survive in those attractors? And so the only thing that my work can reasonably produce is a decent architecture for an unknown and uncertain future. It can't really help the business navigate unknown and uncertain futures. That's what the guys in the suits get paid for, I guess.
So yeah, there's one other question I had, because I was thinking about your stuff a lot before I got on today, and one of the things that I poke at sometimes. So like this guy Alistair McIntyre, he wrote After Virtue, and what he talks about is kind of ethics and decision making, ethical decision making, being like decisions that don't have like quantitative answers. Like I can't math my way to an answer to most ethical questions is like one ways of kind of thinking about it. Can't get from an is to an ought type stuff. And I think often design questions are ought questions. They may not be ethical in the traditional sense of like good and bad, but they are of the same kind. You often, part of the design question is that you can't engineer the answer. You have to basically make a good guess. You got to make some sort of good estimate of I think this would be better. And I think there's all sorts of implications for that. And certainly I think some of what you're talking about, residuality, has something to do with this. Like some of those accretions are only accretions because some random dude somewhere or some random person somewhere made some decision that had nothing to do with anything. But now there's this thing that's residual within the system based on that. Not necessarily on that decision, but that decision had happened, right? And it wasn't again, quantified mathematical type thing. Anyway, so McIntyre likes to talk about this idea that the way we make these decisions is we kind of imagine we're in a story and we go, what story am I in? Like, let's locate the story that I'm in, and then what character am I in that story? What would that character do right now? And that's how we make ethical decisions. So he's pointing towards kind of narrative and story making as being one of the primary ways that we make decisions. And I think, some of what we've been talking about, right, is anti-narrative, anti-sequential, like this type of thinking in a way. Yeah. And the way that I try to point out sometimes is I will say like, and one of the reasons that I thought about this was your story about, but I think you do a dragon story too. But I say, imagine you're on a horseback, you've got a really big knife, there's a big lizard in front of you, what's happening. Like, what do you do? And I point out that people will, come up with, again, like, St. Andrew and the Dragon will be the narrative. And they'll say like, well, I must be a knight. I'm on a horse and I should either attack the dragon or I'm scared of dragons. I'm going to run away, whatever. But I point out to them that the narrative does not come first. The residual things in your language create the context for particular narratives to attach themselves to that context. In a way, these narrative things come from the material context around us, not the opposite way, right? Or at least that there's some sort of ontological loop happening here where the story reproduces the likelihood of swords existing, but the swords reproduce the likelihood of the narrative existing, right? Like kind of this type of loop. So I mean, I just think like it's part of my question has to do with like, there is in this residual theory, there must be this kind of dispositional thing that recognizes that what in my mind at least, what is residual is likely to reproduce certain narratives and certain stories, which means that it's likely to stabilize around those narratives as well. Does that make any sense? Or
Yeah. So one of the rules, I think this is related to the last question because we didn't get back to a point of it. One of the rules of the stressor analysis is that you're not allowed to ever throw away a stressor.
Yeah.
Ever. You're not allowed to ignore them because that stops because we need randomness in the simulation to find these particular retractors. In terms of narrative, I had always seen it as encouraging narrative because whenever I work with this kind of, when I'm doing an architecture, I don't go to people and say, tell me your requirements. And that's actually one of the things we do on day one of the course is that you're never going to say this ever again. You're never going to ask anyone for requirements. And you don't say, tell me your risks. And you definitely don't say, tell me your non-functional requirements. What you say is to people, what keeps you up at night? What are you worried about? What stresses you? What could go wrong here? And I find that very narrative based, and it's people telling stories. They're putting themselves in a position and they're saying, well, one of the things I'm worried about is that this competitor might do this, or that the product might not be good enough, or that we've overestimated the market, or that the numbers that we're basing these business decisions on are flaky, and everyone knows they're flaky, but nobody wants to talk about them. And so there's room, a lot of room for narrative there. And I think that one of the things that happens is that whenever you teach, so if I take some brand new architects, which I'll do in a few weeks, and I teach them these ideas, and I say, give me a list of stressors. Their ability to engage in narrative is actually very, very weak. And the stressors they will give me on day one will be, well, the server goes down, or the database is down, or the database disk is corrupted, or the network is going slow. And I'm like, guys, there's a whole world outside the technology here. Now we need to talk about, a different kind of stress. And then they have to be able to tell stories, and they have to be able to talk about competitors and people in the market and what might happen on a political level that influences the market and things like that. And that's something that needs to be built up over time, that skill, that ability to actually engage in narrative. Tell me a story about it, because every stressor should be a story. Tell me a story about what might happen in this market, because that's what they are. And one of the things I think that sometimes people get confused about is that when we're generating these stressors, it's not just an architect sitting in a room. It's everyone. You do this all the time. Everyone you meet who has any relationship to what you're trying to do, you say, well, what keeps you up at night? What might go wrong? But there's this thing that I talk about called the curse of high dimensionality. It causes people to talk about the things that they're already familiar with. One of the problems that I notice is that when you put everyone in a room together, it gets worse, because they only want to talk about things that they don't want to look stupid. They don't want to talk about lizards, which is why I always lead with lizards and stupid stuff. To get people to realize that probability and being correct isn't what we're trying to get to here, because trying to be correct, which is something that all developers will try to do initially in this work, is something that kills the work very, very quickly and just gets you back onto that path of doing things the way we've always done them.
Yeah. I mean, again, it reminds me a little bit of like negative dialectic style. Like I think what you're pointing to is different than like a user story, or I want the system to do this specific thing story, because the stories you're asking them for are stories not about what the system will do, but what it's likely to do, and what they're concerned that it might do, as opposed to not asking them to tell stories about what they'll do with the system. You're almost asking them to tell stories what the system will do to them, which is like it's a slightly different angle. And again, to me, it's more like what are you worried about with the knife on the horse in the lizard? Like is a different question than saying what's the right thing to do now that you found yourself on the knife on the horse, right?
Very, very much.
Cool. So you've been very generous with your time, and probably getting late there. You were working all day. What are 3 things you'd want people to kind of take away or think about around kind of using these ideas for platform design, platform engineering, or just other ideas that you want to make sure people remember from the conversation?
I think firstly the first thing to take away is that the traditional way that we've done architecture is at the end of the road, and it's time to do something different. And these ideas are something different. I think a second thing I would want people to take away is that it's fantastic that everyone's so interested in complexity, and everyone wants to talk about resilience and all of these things, but we have to make these things practical. There has to be tools that lead to results, not conversations that lead to conversations. There has to be something concrete that comes out of all of these discussions and ideas, and this is something concrete. And the third thing is that these are incredibly practical ideas, so grab them and use them and reflect over them, because one of the best moments I've had in the last couple of years, a very, very senior architect who's built absolutely enormous platforms on a global scale, a very well-known architect, was in one of my workshops on residuality, and at the end of the workshop he said, this is exactly how we think, this is how senior architects think, this is how we work, this is how we get stuff done, but we don't have these words, no one's ever told us these words before, and this is great, and that's an absolutely fantastic thing. So one of the things I would want people to do is to take these ideas, take these things that I'm talking about, and look at your own practice. And you'll realize that if you're a senior architect and you're delivering big stuff, you're already doing this. You just maybe never heard it articulated in this way. Never been exposed to the complexity sciences, so you don't have these ways of describing problems or solutions. But you're probably doing something very, very similar. Because a lot of this work started out with me looking at my own practice and looking at the practice of senior architects and saying, well, what is it that they do that the others don't? And generally, the people who are good are just really negative and pessimistic.
Cool. One warning, not warning, but one anecdotal little side story. It's my understanding that the desk side crits in Schoen's not a book, The Reflective Practitioner, most people believe that they're not real, that they're faked and completely anecdotal, just random design history nonsense. But I still think it's such a great book. It's so interesting. I recommend it to people all the time. I just love the idea that like the bricks can be talking to you, and what you're trying to do is learn how to kind of listen to the bricks better in this kind of like reflective loop that you're in with the work, theory in use and reflection in use type stuff is amazing to me. Barry, how can people find more about your work, engage with you, support you in your work? You're almost on your PhD, so that'll be exciting for everybody to get to read that, I hope. But what else should people look for?
Well, the articles are out there. So there's a new one coming in the next month or two. These things, even when they're approved and everything, publishing, for some reason it takes 3 months to push a button. So the articles are out there. Engage with the articles, talk about them with other people. I think there's been a lot of interest. There's a lot of enthusiasm around it, which is great to see. Use the ideas. A lot of people find that residuality it's a complex topic. There's a lot going on. There's a lot that you have to understand, and people are terrified of doing this wrong. Like, I don't understand everything yet, so I'm not ready to pull the trigger on it. I'm not ready to do this. It's like, and what I have to tell people during the course is you're going to get it wrong anyway, because everything we do is wrong. So you might as well get it wrong now so that you can move into the future. So just execute on the ideas and see what comes out. It can't do any harm. So I'm on Twitter. I'm on LinkedIn as well. Cool. Find me there. And I generally do a lot of my thinking and working out loud there, which can either be entertaining or offensive, depending on your perspective. And it's just stay interested. The book is coming. I keep telling everyone it's coming in 6 months, but I've been saying that for a long time.
I know how that feels. Yep.
Yeah. And so the book's basically going to be the Ph.D. thesis rearranged with more jokes and more lizards and serious things in it.
Good.
And just reach out if you find the ideas interesting, if you want to use them, or if you're using them in a project. It's interesting to hear.
Excellent. Do you want to tell anybody about the sheep behind your shoulder?
Yeah, I have no idea what this is. I'm in a hotel in Norway, and there's a sheep head. Look, it has glasses. I don't know. I know that they eat sheep head here in Norway, so it might be a tribute to their favorite food.
It's like a late night snack on the wall or something.
Yeah. It's a fairly new hotel. Someone manufactured too many sheep heads and said, "What will we do with these?" And it ended up in my room. It's kind of creepy. I'm gonna have to put a towel over it before I go.
All right, Barry, I'm going to link some of your papers, the ones that I enjoyed, down below this episode. I'll give people links to your Twitter and things like that. It was so nice to have a conversation with you. I'm looking forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks at DDD Europe. You're running a 3-day workshop. I assume there's still a couple tickets left. I'll put that down there. And I'm looking forward to hanging out with you there and meeting you in person.
Yeah, cool. Cheers, Jabe.
Cool. Thanks, Barry.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.